one of one of my close friends in the Navy was Les Fleming. Les was not married at the end of the war, so he had to stay in longer than I did. I had enough points to get out when the war was over. But I wrote him a letter when I started law school and told him that I had started law school at Ohio State, and I liked it very much, and I thought the GI Bill was a wonderful thing for veterans. And as it turned out over the years, it was probably the best piece of legislation that was ever passed by Congress because it gave veterans a free education for X number of years, depending on how long they had been in the service. And it increased the tax base so greatly in the United States that the government got back probably $500 in taxes from the increased earning power of the veterans for every dollar that they spent on that education. But anyway, Les got my letter, and he was still on board a ship out in the Pacific someplace, and he threw up his hands and threw up the letter, and he said, finally, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to law school. He immediately writes the University of Michigan for admission, and of course he got in. He had good grades. He was a smart guy. Anyway, he went to law school at Michigan. Same time I went to law school at Ohio State. And as it turned out, he and I went to 33 consecutive Ohio State-Michigan football games. I started getting football tickets in 1948 at Ohio State, and I always got the 4 tickets for the Michigan game. He'd come down one year, and we'd go up there one year. We'd go up on Thursday. We'd play golf usually on Friday. We'd go to the game on Saturday, go to a big party on Saturday night, and then come home on Sunday. It got to be a great event, and our families then went on vacations in the summertime for a period of 10 or 15 years in Michigan, where he lived. Other of my World War II friends who were not with me in the Navy were John Leonard, Kenny McClure, and Tom Lemon. Tom Lemon and Kenny McClure had both been in the Air Force. Tom Lemon had flown B-26s in Europe, and Kenny McClure had flown B-25s in the Pacific. And John Leonard was in the Navy and had command of his own LST. All 3 of them lived in Bexley. Kenny McClure became mayor of Bexley, and he was succeeded by John Leonard. Tom never did run for mayor, but he was always a campaign manager for both of them and was very involved in politics out there. But I bring their names up because every Saturday morning at 8 o'clock, we had a starting time to play golf at the Officers Club, DSCS, at the DCSC in Bexley, and we get out there and have great parties on Saturday night with our wives, and we'd go on vacations together, 4 couples. We all played bridge. We all had a very, very close relationship. Unfortunately, all 3 of the guys are dead, and I miss them a great deal, and I gave the eulogy at 2 of their funerals. The golf was interesting. One morning, Johnny was home on leave. John had gone into the Air Force. He quit law school at the University of Miami the first couple of months and enlisted in the Air Force. And he was home on leave, and he had played golf with the father and son of a friend of his at Scioto Country Club, and had my car and had my golf clubs in the trunk of the car. And Saturday morning when I got up to go to my usual golf at DCSC, he was not home yet. He was out all night with the guys and wasn't home with my car, so I had no golf club. And I was running around the house screaming at Mary Jane about raising a son that would stay out all night, particularly when he had my golf clubs in the car and blah, 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 blah. So finally she said, well, if I were you, I'd quit hollering and take my clubs and take my car and go on out there. So I did. And I got there as the guys were on the tee, and I'd never had a women's club in my hand before in my life. They're shorter, they're smaller around, and so forth. I think I double bogeyed the first hole. I probably doubled or single bogeyed the second hole. Came up to the 3rd hole, which was a par 3, 160 yards. And at that time, I was playing a lot better golf than I ever had before, and I think I took her 8-iron or 7-iron. And hit the ball, and the ball came down on a sprinkler head, took a huge bounce, rolled up on the green, and rolled in the hole. The only thing that was keeping it from going in the hole was the flag. It was up against the hole. It was up against the flag. So John Leonard, my partner John, and I always played Kenny and Tom. And so John runs up and he said, "What's the deal here?" And Kenny said, "Well, if you tip the stick with your finger and it falls in, it's a hole in one." So he ticked the stick and he goes da 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 da, boink! In goes ball. So I had a hole in one off a sprinkler head, and I knew that a lot of prizes were given in those days for a hole in one, depending on what kind of equipment you were using. So I looked first at Mary Jane's golf ball, and it was some off-brand that I had never heard of, and it was a ladies' brand and so forth. So I said to John, I said, "What kind of a ball are you using?" He said, "I'm using a Titleist." And I said, "Well, give me that ball and I'll give you this, and when we get into the clubhouse, I'll turn in this Titleist as the ball I was playing." But you know, you never cheat and cheaters never win. So we get into the clubhouse and the pro said, "Hey, I hear you had a hole in one." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well," he said, "these guys certified to it." He said, "You guys all see it?" "Yeah, we all saw it. Bonafide hole in one." Well, he said, "Here's a catalog of the various things that they give, different brands give for a hole in one." So I'm looking through the thing and I come to Titleist, and they gave a little ashtray. They mounted your ball. You sent your ball in and they printed your name on the ball and the date and where the hole in one was made, and they mounted it on a little ashtray. And I thought, well, that's kind of nice. And I flipped the page, and here I came to something, and it was a 24-inch big number one with a base that looked like the dashboard on a B-17. It had a chronometer and a thermometer and everything else on it. And I looked to see how you got that, and it was if you were using the kind of golf ball that Mary Jane had been using, and I gave John Leonard. Cheaters never win. I didn't have the nerve to say to the club, "Hey, I was lying about that Titleist. I didn't really play the Titleist." So I got stuck with that lousy little ashtray that I ultimately gave to Johnny, because Johnny and I were playing around together at real late at my club in Boca Raton, and Johnny got a hole in one. Well, it wasn't bona fide because there were only two of us playing. You have to have three witnesses. So anyway, I took that Johnny's golf ball and mounted it on my Titleist ashtray and gave him the damn ashtray that I had cheated in giving. But from that day forward, I never altered anything that happened when I was playing golf, because I had sure learned my lesson about cheaters never winning. We played pretty high stakes, Leonard and Lemon and Kenny McClure. We played pretty high stakes. We played at a point where the losers took the winners to dinner on Saturday night after we played, and that included our wives. So Kenny, if John and I would win, Kenny and Tom would pick up the check for all 8 of us. And then we got a little more bold, and we played for the weekend, one weekend a month, that the losers, the ones who lost the most number of times during that month, would have to take the winners to any of the golf clubs in Ohio where they had facilities for staying all night, and the state parks, most of the state parks had golf courses and a place to stay all night. So we started playing for that. Well, that ran into a couple of $100 that the loser would have to play, and it was once a month. And John Leonard and I would win 7 out of 10 times, so it was a real good thing for us. But when the next season rolled around, Tom Lemon said, "Well, we're changing this rule." He said, "From now on, we're playing for tube stakes." And I said, "Tube stakes? What are you talking about?" "Well," he said, "the losers will cook dinner for the winners, and we'll serve tube steaks." I said, "What the hell are tube steaks?" And he said, "Weenies." Anyway, we had a lot of fun. We had more fun. We were very, very close. And John Leonard and I both belonged to the athletic club. We played a lot of handball together. We probably played 3 times a week. He was vice president of Dollar Savings, and they were about 5 minutes in the athletic club. With Frank Gates, I was at 40 South 3rd, which was right beside the Dispatch building, and I was about 5 minutes in the athletic club. And we'd call over at the club when I was in town. I was out of town more than he was, but when I was in town, I'd call over and I'd get an 11:25 reservation on the handball court. We'd get over there and we'd be playing handball by 20 minutes of 12. and we'd play until 1 o'clock, play singles. We'd usually get in about 6 or 7 games. And then we'd rush into the shower, take a shower, and we had a sandwich shop on the second floor. You could go in and get a quick sandwich, and we'd be out of there by about 1 o'clock or a quarter after 1. But we played handball year after year after year, and the athletic club became a very, very important part of my life in Columbus. And I was on the board of directors there for 9 years. And a couple of years ago, I'd been paying my dues. The company used to pay my dues, but then when I retired, they quit paying. No, they continued to pay my dues. And then I get a letter from them, and they said, well, in view of the fact that you seldom, if ever, use the athletic club, we've decided that we no longer want to pay your dues at the athletic club. So I wrote in my letter of resignation to the club and said that I was resigning. And the manager of the club wrote back, and he said, you've been a member of this club for 50 years and you can't resign. We're making you a lifetime member, but we're not charging you any dues. You're an honorary member of the athletic club. So I'm now an honorary member of the athletic club, and I pay no dues, but I can use the facilities whenever I get to Columbus. But since I've become an honorary member, I've never been to Columbus to use the facilities, so I don't know whether I imagine I get the same privileges as I did before. But the athletic club was very important. Mary Jane and I used to spend a number of Saturday nights down there. I was the primary entertainer for the Frank Gates Company, and I always, for every football game, had clients in for football games, and we'd entertain them, always taking them to the athletic club, always putting them up at the athletic club if they were staying overnight. And it became a very, it was really our social life. And Mary Jane was such a great hostess that she was always fun to be with there. She was a magnificent dancer. She, as Jeannie Henry is, and neither of them, when they go to dance, ever sit out a dance because somebody's always with them asking them to dance. Another one of my very good friends, and about whom a book could well be written, with the title "The Most Unforgettable Character I've Ever Known," with a fellow by the name of Tom George. Tom Brixey was the chief lawyer for Midland Ross Corporation in Cleveland. They were clients of ours, and I became very good friends of Brixey. Brixey had been a Marine in World War II, tough character, but a brilliant labor lawyer. He went up against the best of them, and 9 times out of 10 he would win. And he became acquainted with a fellow by the name of Tom George. One day Brixey was coming down from Cleveland to Columbus, and he called me. He said, I'm going to be down there for a couple of days, and he said, I'm bringing a friend of mine who you got to meet. He said, this guy is one real character, and he's our kind of guy. So I said, okay, I'll meet you at the athletic club for lunch. I got there about 11:30. He walks in with this fellow, Tom George. Tom George was one of the ugliest guys I've ever seen. He was bald, had kind of a funny shaped head, but was one of the smartest guys I've ever run into in my life. He was an underwater demolition, a frogman in World War II. He came out of the service and became a strip miner in northeastern Ohio and became very wealthy from the coal. But he also became very wealthy because he started a plant that built these skids that you use when you're lifting heavy objects. You put them on trucks and you leave them right on the skid. Pallets, they call them pallets. The timber that he cut off of the land that he was going to scrape out the coal on, he had a lumber manufacturing company, and he manufactured these pallets. And one of his customers was Midland Ross. Midland Ross manufactured rolled steel in Cleveland, and they bought these pallets to put the rolls of steel on, where they would cinch them down, and the loading devices would come in and stick the thing in there, lift them up, and put them on the trucks and so forth. Anyway, here comes Tom George. So Tom Brixey always had to have a couple of martinis before lunch, so we ordered 3 martinis at the athletic club, and then we had to have a second martini, and the subject got around to Indian wrestling. That's where you put your arm on the desk and the other guy puts his arm on the table and you start going over to see whether one guy can push the other guy over or you got to push it over here. Depending on the strongest guy, down goes the arm. So I'm sitting across the table from Tom George, and he and I start Indian wrestling in the athletic club. But we were back in a corner where nobody could see us, so we weren't really creating a scene. But the next thing I know, we're ready to order, and it's 2:30 in the afternoon, and they'd closed the kitchen at the athletic club. So I said, well, we'll go across the street to Marzetti's, the famous Marzetti's restaurant. It was still open. We went in there, sat down, ordered, started Indian wrestling again, and the first thing that happened was that we slid the tablecloth off the table, and the dishes went clanking on the floor and so forth, and the manager came up and he said, you fellas will have to leave. So they literally kicked us out of Marzetti's. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So as we're walking out, I said to Brixie, we're going out the back door. There was a back door that went into the back side of the Episcopal Church on the corner of Broad and 3rd. We went out that back door into an alley. And as we're going out, I said to Brixie, I said, that little son of a bitch is not going to beat me at Indian wrestling. I said, I'm going out there and we're going to do stand-up Indian wrestling. And he said, Jack, be careful. Don't get this guy mad or he'll beat the hell out of you. This guy is tough. You're not fooling with some average guy off the street. You're fooling around with a frog man, an underwater demolition guy who is still in the best shape of anybody you ever saw. And he said, I'll tell you what happened to him when the union tried to organize his coal miners. He said they came down the road, marching down the road, mine workers, United Mine Workers, and Tom had 2 shotguns, and he was standing on his property. And these guys were on the public road. And they stopped in front of his mine office and made their demands and so forth. And he said, you guys get off that public road and get back on the other side or I'm going to shoot every one of you. And they said, you wouldn't dare fire a shot. He's got an automatic shotgun in each hand. He fired a couple of blasts down into the blacktop in front of them, and the buckshot sprayed up off of the blacktop into their legs, and they couldn't get out of there fast enough. And that was the last attempt they ever made to try to organize it because he scared them off with a shotgun. But that's how tough he was. One of his properties was at a little town called Bergholz, Ohio. And after he had mined it out with the strip mines, he had recovered the land and had trees planted in there by the senior class of the high school. The senior class needed to raise money to go on an outing when they graduated, and they were trying to earn money, and he hired the entire senior class of the high school to come out and plant trees on the property, pine trees, and they planted literally thousands of trees on this property. But he made some incredibly great lakes on there that were down in kind of a winding road that went down from where his lodge was. He built a big lodge, and one of the interesting things about this lodge was that it was all open at the bottom on the first floor, and at the top on the second floor there was a railing and a walkway all the way around to all the bedrooms. There were about 6 bedrooms on the second floor, and he had the bar down on the first floor, and the bar got about 10 feet long. He had about 10 bar stools in there, and he had seat belts on all the bar stools. It was the only bar stool I was ever in my life that you sit down in the bar stool and fasten your seat belt because you were going to go for a real ride in one of his bars as he was mixing up some of his favorite drinks. But anyway, I was telling John Leonard about this place. It was in the wintertime. We were going over to visit him on a weekend, and he said, I had told Tom George about John Leonard, and John Leonard was in the bank business, and Tom was looking for some money, and he wanted to get together with. So anyway, Gail and John went over with Mary Jane and myself. We got over to his place about 8 o'clock on a Friday night, and it had snowed all the way over there, and we got there, and it was snow, just magnificent, covered. We must have had 2 feet of snow. Well, Tom had a couple of snowmobiles, and we started drinking. It got to be about midnight, and I asked Tom, I said, you got a snowmobile out there handy? He says, yeah, there's one right outside the door. And I said, well, I'm going to take John a ride. It's a real nice moonlight night. And he said, where are you going? I said, I'm going down that ski ramp that you have going down to the lake. Well, he said, be careful because it's going to be awful slick down there. So John got up behind me on this snowmobile. We rev that thing up and we're sailing down. And we come to the ski ramp and we sit down. And the first curve we miss and we take off into the air. We land in the top of a tree that had grown up, one of these pine trees I was telling you about that had been planted. We land that snowmobile in the top of the tree. And we're sitting up there going back and forth with that thing. like a Christmas tree ornament on top of this thing. John says, what the hell are we going to do now? How are we going to get out of this thing? I said, very carefully reach your hand back and see if you can find the dirt. But I said, don't move too strenuously here. We'll tip this snowmobile off the top of this tree. I said, reach back and see if you can find the dirt. And he reached back and he said, I can find some vines or something. And I said, okay, start pulling this back very carefully and see if you can get the back of this snowmobile back against the earth, and then you slide off, and then after you slide off, I'll try to slide off. So he said, okay. So he gets back and he gets a hold of the vines and he slides off all right. And I inch my way back into the back of the snowmobile, and I finally get a hold of the vines, and I get out of the snowmobile. Okay, the snowmobile is still sitting in the tree. We walk back to the house, and Tom said, did you have a good ride? And I said, yeah. He said, I didn't hear you come up. And I said, no, the snowmobile's down there with the scooter. We said, why didn't you bring it back? I said, we left it in the top of a tree. He said, you what? I said, we left it at the top of the tree. He said, I don't believe it. So he gets a flashlight and goes down there, and about an hour later he comes back. Mary Jane and Gail were still sitting at the bar. He said, I can't believe it. He said, those bastards left my snowmobile in the top of the tree. I don't know how we're ever going to get it out. Well, the next morning when it got light, we went down through a rope around and so forth and got it up. Tom had a shooting range. This will interest you. He had a trap house. And he had the high house and the low house, the medium house. And everybody he had half a dozen shotguns, but I usually took my own shotgun. But anyway, one day we're shooting trap out of there. And he said, well, I'm going to start throwing birds out. He said, I've got a bunch, the kids caught a bunch of pigeons the other night in the barn. He said, I got a couple of sacks of pigeons. So he said, I'm going to throw a pigeon out for you instead of a trap. He said, it makes a better target. So he said, each one that comes up, he said, announce who you are when you get up there. So Brixie shooting. He said, okay, out goes a pigeon. And the pigeon goes like that. So the next guy was Joe Jones or whoever. And who is this? This is Joe Jones. Out goes the pigeon. See? So I get up and he said, who's this? And I said, it's Spittler. With that, wah! The biggest squawking thing you ever saw. He'd thrown a guinea hen out of the thing instead of a pigeon. And this thing went up. Those, if you know what a guinea hen is, they are used in many countries as an alarmist to wake people up they're like a watchdog. The slightest little commotion, and they start squawking like nothing you'd ever heard. But anyway, he threw this guinea hen out, and I was so discombobulated with all that squawking the thing. They're a big bird, bigger than a pheasant, but I missed it. But I could sit here and probably tell another hour of stories about the things that we had done with Tom George. He ultimately sold out in Ohio and moved to Frostproof, Florida, and built a beautiful place down there out of logs. He built a two-story, it was like a 5-bedroom log cabin. Not just rough logs, but the smooth logs they have. It was just an absolutely gorgeous place on this lake. And it was a good fishing lake, and it was a great place to have a retirement home because he loved to fish, and he could just literally walk across the little path and get in his boat and go fishing as long as he had. But he became a big-time alcoholic. I mean, to the point where he was not just drinking a fifth a day, he was getting into a half gallon and almost finished. He'd start drinking the minute he got out of bed, straight vodka, and drink straight vodka all day long. One day I got a letter from him, and it said, Dear Jack and Mary Jane, I just can't tell you how much I've enjoyed having you as my friends. The wonderful times that we had together are highlights of my life. You guys are the greatest. He signed Tom George, 1916, 2004, or whatever the date was. It was 2001. 2001. I thought, what a funny way to sign. 1916-2001. So I picked up the phone and called his home, and his daughter answered the phone. His daughter was superintendent of schools in Seattle. And I said, you're home with your dad? And I said, yes. And I said, I just got his letter. I said, did this letter mean what I think it did? And he said, yeah. She said, Dad died last week. And I said, when did he write these letters? Well, he said, the doctor had told him that his liver had completely failed. And he said he was dying. The doctor said, you don't have 2 weeks to live. So he said, Tom, he called all of us in, and we did all the things you would normally do when somebody's on their deathbed. And he asked for 9 sheets of paper. And she said he wrote 9 letters, and you and Mary Jane were one of the people that he wrote this letter to. And he didn't say a thing about he was dying or anything like that. Just at the end where he wrote Tom George, he puts 1916, 2001. So anyway, that was the end of Tom George. He was a very enjoyable part of our life, and I missed him a lot because we fished a lot. We hunted wild boar in Florida. We hunted in Guatemala. We hunted in South America, many places, and just had a great time. He became a great friend of our oldest son, John, who used to go up from Miami and fish with him. So that's kind of that. As far as my friends are concerned, and our travels and so forth, I guess I don't have too much more to say, except that we moved from Upper Arlington, Ohio to Boca Raton, Florida, and had probably the 10 best years of our life. Mary Jane found a place down there that was just absolutely exhilarating. We were completely surrounded, as most of you know, by water. We were on the 18th floor of this condominium. We watched the sun come up over the ocean on one side, and we watched it set over the ocean on the other side. We were completely surrounded by water. We had just an absolutely idyllic life while we were there, and Mary Jane started manifesting some forgetfulness, and it became worse. And I remember the first event, she was a great member of the Republican Party, and monthly they'd have a luncheon at one of the better restaurants there, and she had been to them for a number of years, and she left for this one, and she came home in about a half an hour, and normally it was about a 2-hour affair. And I said, why are you home so early? She said, I got lost. She said, I couldn't find the place. And I thought, oh, I've been watching this kind of come on. And I said, well, darling, I forgot to tell you, they sent out a notice that they had changed the place. They're no longer meeting there. So no wonder you couldn't find it. It's a good thing you couldn't find it. Well, from then on, it just continued to get worse. And she was diagnosed with, it wasn't Alzheimer's, but it was something akin to that. And there wasn't any question. It didn't make any difference whether they called it Alzheimer's or whatever they called it, but the result was still the same. We had visited Signal Mountain a number of times on our way to Florida. Signal Mountain is about halfway between Columbus, Ohio, and Miami, or Boca Raton. And when we were going to Florida or coming back from Florida, we always made our first stop here and spent a couple of days and then went on whichever way we were going. And we had visited a place called Alexian Village. It was in the building process, and we thought it was very nice, and we made a down payment on one of the condos in one of the buildings. And the building was finished, and they called us and told us that our 6th floor condominium overlooking the valley was ready, but we were having such a great experience in Boca Raton that we decided we weren't ready to move, so we declined, and somebody else bought it, and then we went down to the foot of the list. And about 4 years later, they called us again and said they had another condo for us, and at that time, Mary Jane had manifested a condition that I knew that she couldn't enter the place with the condition she was, because they give you a physical, you have to be in good health. So we declined that time, and then all of the kids were down in Florida visiting us one Christmas, and they talked us into Mary Jane going into a health care facility in Boca. And we looked around with the nurse. I had a great, absolutely incredibly great nurse, Patty Adams, who married John Kilpatrick, who became Patty Kilpatrick. And she would go out and look at 2 or 3 places, and if she thought I would like to see them, then I'd go out and look at 1 or 2 of them. Well, she finally found a place that we both agreed would be really great for Mary Jane. And Mary Jane went into that place, and at that time she didn't know that she was any place other than where she'd always been, because she'd had really lost it. And then Cozy, bless her heart, convinced me that it was high time that my health was looked after and that I come up here and enter this place. And she said, I've just found a great condo for you. It overlooks the valley and you'll like it and it's painted white and so forth. And I said, well, can I bring my furniture? And she said, no, your furniture is all Florida, white and so forth. And she said, everybody up here has dark furniture. She said, you just have to get rid of your furniture down there and buy dark furniture when you come up here. So I had stock in budget rent-a-car. And they sent out a coupon that you could rent a truck for, I don't know, like $300 for 3,000 miles or something. It was a ridiculously low price in Florida because they were moving their trucks from Florida back up north after the winter season. This was in the spring. So I took the coupon and found out what it would cost, and I could rent that truck and move my stuff up for $300. And I called Cozy and I said, hey, I'm going to move my stuff up there rather than go to the expense of $5,000 or $6,000 or whatever it's going to be to buy new furniture, which I don't want anyway because I like the furniture that we have. So we rented the truck, and Johnny drove the truck, and we came up here and unloaded in the place where we're making these pictures right now. And an interesting sidelight of that was I was standing out unloading the truck, or watching him unload the truck. I wasn't. Alan was here moving the stuff in, and Casey and some of the neighbors. And my neighbor next door walked up to me and introduced himself, and I introduced myself, and we got to talking about where we were from, and he was from Walter Reed Hospital, and I said, did you know Earl W. Brannan? And he said, you mean General Pat Brannan? And I said, yeah. He said, he's been one of my best friends in the Air Force for 25 years. I said, I cannot believe it. He said, yeah. He said, I've served with Pat in several different hospitals, and he was my commanding officer at Walter Reed when I was there for 4 years and so forth. So we became fast friends. But I thought it was kind of a coincidence that our next door neighbor here, as we moved in, had been a close personal friend of Mary Jane's brother, who had passed away at that time. And he had passed away from malignant melanoma at age 52. He had found a little bump on his finger and hadn't done anything about it. And one day he runs into a friend of his who was a plastic surgeon, and they had him look at it, and he said, Pat, come in and we'll do a biopsy. Pat went into his office, they did the biopsy, and he said, you've got 6 months to live. Pat died within 6 months, almost to the day, from this malignant melanoma that first manifested itself on the inside of one of his fingers and ultimately took over his entire body. Pat had retired from the Air Force at that time, had a magnificent home in Pacific Palisades in California, overlooking the Pacific Ocean up on a high cliff, and was one of the more eminent orthopedic surgeons in the world, and had gone with the best firm, the best group in California, or probably in the United States. People came to them for orthopedic operations from New York City and every place else. But Pat died very prematurely. Bobby Brannan, who was Pat's oldest son, has just written a book. A couple of weeks ago, he sent us a copy, and it's sent to the Spittlers. Writing this book was a real labor of love. I hope you enjoy it. Love to all, Bobby Brannan, November 1907. And in this book, he starts off talking about various things that are kind of interesting. The preface: I am an American fighting in the forces which guard my country and our way of life. I am prepared to give my life in their defense. And then he goes on and talks about the oath that you take when you become a military or naval officer. And in his prologue, he talks about the history of the Brannans in the Civil War. He starts off, 2 boys were marching on tired feet over dusty roads of northern Virginia, Maryland, and southeastern Pennsylvania. It was in their latter part of June 1863. They were marching with 2 different armies, both moving on parallel roads about 25 miles apart and heading for a place called Gettysburg. And it turns out that these 2 brothers, one was in the Union Army, one was in the Confederate Army, and they fought against each other at Gettysburg. And that was kind of the start of the family as far as being in the service is concerned. Then he's got another chapter in here about the beginnings of the families. In the mid-1880s, both the Brannan and the Barlow families were moved from Illinois to Belvidere, Nebraska. The Brannans were from Nebraska, and as I said earlier, Earl Brannan and Cosette Brannan both graduated from the University of Nebraska. But then this part talks about the history of the Brannans. And then it has a very interesting letter in here that Pat wrote to me. And then they have letters in here that Chuck wrote to Mary Jane and me about the military heritage and so forth. And then Chuck, who was the youngest of the two brothers, was Pat's youngest brother. Chuck was in the regular army. He was a paratrooper. And he was in World War II and jumped in the Pacific on a couple of missions with the paratroopers and was awarded the Silver Star in World War II, and he earned 2 Purple Stars for wounds suffered in World War II. Then Korea comes along, and he volunteered to go to Korea. When he got to Korea, instead of letting him continue as a paratroop officer, they made an infantry officer of him. And the 3rd week he was in Korea, his company was ambushed, and he was out with 2 machine guns, one in each hand, holding off the Chinese while his company was getting turned around in this road, and it was a roadblock, and they were just getting massacred. I think the book says in this particular operation they suffered 80% casualties. And in the face of this fire, Chuck was out trying to find a truck that would run, and he finally found a weapons carrier, and he was throwing wounded guys onto the weapons carrier with one hand and getting his company turned around and firing a machine gun with the other. And he was shot in the neck, and they finally got his company turned around and got back about 6 miles to a hospital, and all of his men were attended to before he would let them touch him, and finally he was sent out to a hospital ship. And for that, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. And about 3 weeks later, he's back to duty after they'd repaired his neck. He was back up on the front lines. And 3 weeks or 4 weeks after that, he was again in a tremendous engagement that lasted for 4 days, and for which he was recommended for 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, both posthumously, because the second one, he was shot between the eyes and was killed and died in a hospital in Japan. And he was, after he was shot between the eyes, he lived for almost a month. And Pat was still, at that time, a general in the Air Force. Pat flew out to Japan to this hospital and realized that since Chuck had never regained consciousness, that there was just no hope. And he sent us a telegram and said that Chuck had been wounded, and there was no hope for his recovery, and that he would die almost any time. And almost at the same time that we got that telegram, we got another telegram that said that he'd passed away. But he was one of the most highly decorated men in the infantry, in the Army infantry, in the Korean War. And he was buried with highest military honors that could be given in Arlington Cemetery. And on his headstone is the fact that he had 2 Distinguished Service Medals and Purple Hearts and so forth. And there's the book is primarily, the early part of the book is devoted to the bravery of Charles. Charles was a great guy. The last time I saw him alive, Pat was here in Columbus visiting us, and Chuck was visiting us, and it was St. Patrick's Day, and we went over to the athletic club and started drinking Irish whiskey at 10 o'clock in the morning, and we marched in the St. Patrick's Day parade side by side in our uniforms down the street in Columbus, Ohio, and then he went to Korea, and that was where he was killed. One of the activities in which I became very heavily involved, not necessarily because Chuck was in the Navy League. We started a Navy League council in Columbus, Ohio, John Leonard and I and some of our friends, and we were going to limit the membership to 100. we knew that it would be very easy to get 100 members, and we wanted it to be kind of an exclusive club. So we limited it to 100, and we had 100 people in about 2 months. So then we raised it to 200, and we got 200. Then we raised it to 500, and we got 500. We ended up with 700 members in Columbus, Ohio, in this council. And John Leonard was president ahead of me. And then when he was through, I became president. And we went literally to every National Navy League convention for years. Walter Miles, who owned the Miles Theater, which was a string, I suppose he had a half dozen drive-in theaters in Columbus. And Walter used to pick up the tab and pay our expenses to go to these Navy League councils. Very generous guy. And he also paid our expenses to go to 5 consecutive Army-Navy games in Philadelphia. I went on to become national president of the Navy League, and I'm written up very well in a book that's just out called Navy League of the United States, and they have a number of things to say about my administration. I took over in a declining membership era, and by the time I had gotten out of there, we had over 2,500 new members, and it was at the time that Ronald Reagan had defeated Jimmy Carter for president, and I was writing Carter, trying to get him. Carter had graduated from the Naval Academy, and he was decimating the Navy. As a matter of fact, he was cutting the appropriations terribly in all the armed forces, but he had cut the appropriations back about 50% for the Navy. And one of the letters that I wrote to him, and as a matter of fact, I delivered it to him personally and handed it to him, and he said, "What are you trying to tell me here?" And I said, "I'm trying to tell you that you're destroying the United States Navy." And he said, "Well, I'm not going to talk about that." And he was with Brzezinski, and he said, "Brzezinski, you take care of this man," whatever it was. But part of what I wrote in one is, I said, "The reports that I have read appall and frighten me." This was my letter to Carter. "The reports that I have read appall and frighten me. I implore you to pay more than lip service to the terribly serious needs of the Navy. Throughout the country, I hear those who are convinced that the Navy is deliberately, systematically, and ruthlessly being decimated against the recommendations of your senior naval and military advisors. I would advise you to act now to reverse this suicidal trend before our country is destroyed." But there are a lot of things in here that anybody that wants to can look through here and find a lot of my quotations. I went in when the Navy League was losing memberships rapidly. We got over 2,500 new members in my 2-year term and got the Navy turned around financially. The Navy League, at the time I became president, had been renting property in Washington, D.C. for about 50 years. And I started a campaign to buy our own building and succeeded. And we bought a building for $950,000, remodeled it, rented space in it. Then it was ultimately torn down and a new building was put on the property. And today the place is assessed at $65 million. So it was $950,000 we paid for it. So from a $950,000 investment, we went to a $60 million piece of property in Arlington, Virginia. I've made a couple of notes here in other times when I had thought I would write a book maybe, and this is why I'm so glad, Doug, that you're interviewing me and doing this thing now, because it really, I never got around to writing the book. All I did was make a whole bunch of notes, and most of which are not hardly legible. I see one note here. I have some of our countries that we visited during our marriage, places we stayed, and rivers we rode. We have been in Moscow, Leningrad, on the Volga River. We've been in Netherlands, Amsterdam. We've been in Flanders. We've been in Belgium, France, Luxembourg, Germany, Austria, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, North Pole, South Pole, Norway, England, Greece, Hungary, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, Monaco, Portugal, Scotland, Spain, Switzerland, Achaia, Ireland, Antigua, Aruba, Bahamas, Bermuda, Monaco, Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, Puerto Rico, St. Croix, St. John, St. Lucia, St. Thomas, Virgin Conda, Cuba, uh, Banff, Calgary, Jasper, Lake Louise, Vancouver, Victoria, Ottawa, Toronto, Montreal, Quebec City. We've rafted the Colorado River for 7 days. We've been in Mexico, Acapulco, Bahia, Cancun, Cuernavaca, Montezuma, Mexico City, been in Guadalajara, Puerto Vallarta, San Miguel, South America, been in Africa, Australia, Philippine Islands, New Guinea, Borneo, New Hebrides, Fiji, Truk, and so forth. To name a few, can you imagine that? In our lifetime we've been in those places. We've been in all of the 50 states. The places we have stayed, there's a long list and there's no point in reading them all, but we've stayed in some of the best hotels throughout the United States. In a magazine not too long ago, I tore out a page that said, it was entitled, 20 Things You Should Do in This Lifetime. And the reason we did them was because they were things to which I had always aspired. And here's a list of 20 things you should do in your lifetime. 1, visit the country your ancestors called home. Well, we did that, of course. We visited Ireland, we visited Scotland, and so forth. We visited France, we visited Germany. Leave $1 where a kid will find it. I did that one time on the street, and it was very satisfying. Fly over the Grand Canyon in a helicopter. Well, we not only flew over the Grand Canyon in a helicopter, we rafted the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon, and after 7 days on the river, we flew out of the Grand Canyon on a helicopter, flew over to Las Vegas. Lend money to a friend without expecting it back. Ride in a gondola down the Grand Canal in Venice, Italy, which we've done. Teach a class, I've done that. See the sunrise over the ruins at Machu Picchu, we've done that. Plant a tree, we've done that. Fly on the Concorde, I never got around to that, and now they're out of commission, so I'll never get that done. Stand on the Great Wall of China, we've done that. Make your own beer, I've done that. See an opera at La Scala in Milan, Italy, we've done that. Learn to speak French, I never did that. Take a balloon ride over the Serengeti. Well, we took a balloon ride out of in New Mexico. We took a balloon ride for over an hour, and we flew over. It was a day when they were having a balloon fiesta in New Mexico. I forget this little town. You'd recognize it if I could remember it. But we, Mary Jane was in the chase car, and I was in the balloon. And the chase car follows the route of the balloon as you float around. And Mexico, New Mexico and Arizona and those states out there are like Nebraska. The roads are all 1 mile by 1 mile, everything is square. Here in Tennessee, the roads are all over the place because of the mountains, but out there, boy, they're on section lines. 640 acres is a section of land, and a section is 1 mile by 1 mile by 1 mile by 1 mile. Anyway, the balloon floats along, and the people in the car have a trailer following you so that when you come down, they can load the balloon and the gondola into the trailer, and then you come back to wherever you're going. So we're in this balloon, and we were up there for probably 2.5 hours. And the interesting thing about it is that when you come down kind of hard. The thing bounces on the ground, but finally the balloonist, the guy that's flying the thing, jumps out and steadies the basket, and then you get out. And the first thing you do, he says, "Now kneel down," and then he stands behind you and reads something. I have it in there in a frame to the effect, "Now you have conquered the elements and have ridden in the blah 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 blah." Then all of a sudden he pours champagne all over your head, and that's where they celebrate you riding the first balloon. Hang up on a lawyer. I've done that a lot of times. Kiss someone passionately in public. I've done that. Play the old course at St. Andrews. I've done that and played courses in Ireland. shoot the rapids at the Snake River in Idaho. I've done that. Fly a glider. I've done that. Do aerobics in an airplane. I've done that. But those are things that 20 things that you should do in a lifetime, and I've done all but 2 of them. I didn't learn French, and there's one other thing in there I didn't do. But anyway, I've had a full life. I've done some things that I wish I hadn't done. I've done a lot of things that I'm glad I did do. And one of the things that I'm doing that I'm so glad I did was to start a scholarship in memory of Mary Jane. And here at Election Village, and at this time we've awarded 42 scholarships. And we have nearly $250,000 in the bank in perpetuity to render these additional scholarships, and we're still collecting money. In closing, I want to talk about Mary Jane, who was one of the most fabulous people I ever knew, and I don't know how God ever blessed me to bring us together, because she was a doer. She was in the PTA, she was in the Girl Scouts, she was Mrs. Everything in Upper Arlington, Ohio. She loved to be involved with kids, she loved to be involved with people. She was generally not peripherally involved, she was generally right in the middle of the things. She was a mother from heaven. She raised our kids so beautifully. I was tougher than than she was, and she was always an ameliorating force between me and the children. Don't do this. And don't. She had a fabulous personality. Our kids are all alive and well. Mary Jane, of course, is gone. But Johnny, when Jeannie, Henry, and I went down this last spring, to go to a Coral Ridge Presbyterian thing that they have annually down there. Jeannie is a big Presbyterian person, as was Mary Jane. And so Johnny and Jimmy got to meet Jeannie, and Johnny said to me, I don't know how one guy could be so lucky as to have been involved with 2 ladies of such proportions as my mother and Jeannie. He said, he says, I've been married 4 times and I still haven't made it. But in closing, I'm reminded of the sadness that can occur from events throughout your life. The saddest, of course, by far was the death of Mary Jane. And I think of her constantly. I think of the premature deaths of her parents. Her mother died prematurely at age 52. Her dad died at 62. I think of my brother, King, who we buried several years ago from a malignant melanoma that on top of his head, started on top of his head, cancer. I couldn't have been blessed more with a brother. The sweetest guy, absolutely, that ever could be. We never had a harsh word. We've been in a number of business deals, and wherever there was the slightest doubt about anything, he always, invariably, resolved any doubts in my favor. And there was never any question about what we were going to do. If I wanted to do it one way, and he thought we ought to do it another way, he would generally relinquish it or attempt to sway me with arguments that were of such value that we would do it his way. But we had a cattle feeding business in Nebraska. We had an irrigation project in Nebraska. We had a number of other business ventures, all of which were successful, with the exception of the cattle feeding thing. The price of cattle went down and the price of feed went up, and we went broke. But King was absolutely incredible. My wife, my brother. I had sadness, of course, when we lost Eric, my grandson. I had great sadness, of course, when we lost Pat Brannon, and especially when we lost Chuck Brannon, one of the bravest men that I have ever known or heard of in my lifetime. And I want to thank you for putting this thing together. I think we've covered about everything. If anybody can think of anything else, write me a letter and we'll talk about it. But thanks a lot, Doug. You were wonderful. And I'm very proud of your success and how you're handling these things too. As I am proud of everybody, your brother and your mother did a great job raising you. Okay, au revoir. God bless.